So what is Tantra? Well, this is the name that scholars give to a spiritual movement that arose in the Indian subcontinent about 1500 years ago. In fact, the Tantric tradition, despite the fact that it flourished for many, many centuries, never had a single name. So nowadays, we just use the word Tantra to designate this entire spiritual movement that flourished from about the year 500 to about the year 1200 in the Indian subcontinent. And it continued to be influential for many centuries after that, of course, just talking about the period of its flourishing. The word is subject to much confusion in the modern period. Sometimes you'll hear people use the phrase classical Tantra to distinguish the topic we're discussing here from Neo-Tantra. So Neo-Tantra is the name that scholars give to teachings and practices of sacred sexuality that originated primarily in the United States. So when you hear people talk about tantric sex, that is a feature of Neo-Tantra, not classical Tantra. There is a form of classical Tantra that is well known to most people, and I refer here to the tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. So a lot of people don't realize, but Tibetan Buddhism is Tantric Buddhism. So virtually all the teachings in Tibetan Buddhism come from Tantras. And that's, by the way, where the tradition gets its name. The scriptures were historically called Tantras. The point is that the Dalai Lama and other lamas and Tibetan Buddhist monks are all tantrikas. They're all practitioners of Tantra, specifically Buddhist Tantra. Now, that particular form of Buddhist Tantra is a bit different because it is monasticized, which is a little bit odd because Tantra was originally conceived as a form of spiritual practice appropriate for non-monastics, appropriate for householders, as we call them. So Tantra is that spiritual tradition that was designed for householders originally. In the Indian tradition, up until Tantra came along, people believed that spiritual enlightenment meant transcending this world and achieving a kind of higher state of consciousness and a higher plane of being. So this is what we call a transcendentalist view, that the whole goal of the spiritual path is to transcend embodiment, to transcend this problematic world. So Tantra is the first major spiritual tradition in this part of the world, South Asia, that taught a different kind of spiritual enlightenment and spiritual liberation, which did not involve transcending this body in this world, but rather was called Jivan Mukti in Sanskrit, which means living liberation. Liberation, freedom, awakeness, what people often call enlightenment, while being in this body, while being in this world, while engaged with life instead of renouncing life. The Tantric tradition became profoundly influential, teaching forms of meditation that instead of transcending the body and the senses, allowed us to realize our true nature while at the same time being fully intimate with embodiment, with the world, with the senses. You're getting the idea, I hope, that Tantra was for many, many, many centuries the only indigenous South Asian tradition that taught a form of liberating spiritual practice specifically for householders. Now, almost everyone watching this video, most of you are householders, whether or not you have a house, right? Because it's just a term that means a non-renunciate, somebody living in the world. And therefore, Tantra is for you. It was designed for people like you who are trying to live in the world functionally, but also pursue a spiritual path. So Tantra is that tradition that teaches how these can be perfectly, harmoniously interwoven, right? So Tantra teaches the obliteration of the false dichotomy between spiritual practice and worldly life. So basically, then, Tantra taught that sexuality could be part of the spiritual path, but so could everything, right? The preparation and serving of food is part of the spiritual path, right? The moving of the body through space is part of the spiritual path. So the original tradition that, again, we often call classical Tantra, did not especially highlight sexuality, but it did include sexuality along with everything else. So again, it is precisely that tradition that teaches how to incorporate every aspect of life in this awareness. So we don't, on the tantric path, seek a higher plane of consciousness, right? Or a higher level of being. In fact, we seek to realize the divinity here on earth, in this body, in this level of being, right? So the tantrika, at the culmination of their journey, doesn't find themselves in some higher astral plane, but right here on earth, fully saying yes to this life, to this body, to this reality, but also seeing it in a very different way from how most people see it, as a manifestation of consciousness. And we'll explore more what that means as the course goes on.